I can hand. I'm going to hand them out. So if everybody will just come in and grab a seat. We have a handout. Anybody that's on live stream, we're thrilled to be with you. We're getting our act together, and we'll start in a few minutes. So there are handouts. Please grab a seat towards the front. Unless you don't want to sit with everybody, then go find a corner. Sit next to Barbara and Carl. Okay, Sandy, you're up. Huh?
Yeah, everybody made their way? Shabbat Shalom. On behalf of the Adult Education Committee and the Antisemitism Initiative Team, I want to welcome you to our annual Glatzer Memorial Weekend. It is a special pleasure to be initiating this weekend, standing here in person and back in our sanctuary. At the height of Omicron, Terry said to me, maybe we'll do a dinner for Glatzer. And we had a plan, keeping all our options open, and I have to admit, I took her lead, but I didn't believe it. I thought she was being very optimistic, but she was right, and here we are in this place. This evening, it's a privilege to welcome our scholar in residence and Temple Emunah member, Dr. Rachel Fish, and we're also honored to welcome Dr. Judith Wexler, who is the daughter of Professor Nachum and Ann Glatzer. This year marks the 44th year since the inception of the Glatzer Memorial Fund at Temple Emunah. We're deeply indebted to Norm and Millie Koss, who were the founders of the Glatzer Memorial Weekend and had the original vision to invite fellow congregant Professor Nachum Glatzer to be our scholar for a special weekend at Temple Emunah. And on it has gone from there. Glatzer Memorial Weekend is the highlight of our adult education offerings. And I want to acknowledge the generosity of our friends of Glatzer Memorial Weekend. The list of friends is in the shofar for the weekend. Your generosity makes it possible for us to continue the work of Millie and Norm Koss in honoring the memories of Professor Nachum and Ann Glatzer while bringing quality Jewish learning to our community. Thank you. At this time, I'd like to invite Dr. Judith Wexler to speak with us about her parents and their early years and their escape westward in 1914. Dr. Judith Wexler, a scholar in her own right, taught art history for 40 years, spending 22 years as the National Endowment for Humanities professor at Tufts University. She was a 3-time visiting professor at the Hebrew University and a visiting professor at Harvard University and, I haven't had French in a long time, the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. Dr. Wexler has made 30 documentary films, including Nahum Glatzer and the German Jewish Tradition. And she was knighted by the French government. Judith, please come.
I'm going to tell you a little bit about my father's early years in his own words. My father was born in Lemberg, which we know today as Lviv. So it's very much on all our minds. He was interviewed by Chaim Potok back around 1980, and he asked him about his early years. And my father replied to his question, what sort of education did you have in Lemberg? Lemberg was then Austro-Hungary, before it became Poland, before it became Soviet Union, before it became Ukraine. My father responded at age 3 or 4 until 11. I had several teachers. Father was very generous with Hebrew teachers for Tanakh, Rashi, and another for Gemara. I started at age 7. What did you start with? What was the procedure for studying? The teacher read the passage.
Go ahead.
The teacher read the passage, and I repeated, and he interpreted it, and then I did. And he then went on to ask, and then my father said, I also had a Hebrew language and literature teacher. And Potok asks him, wasn't it unusual to have a father teach his son Hebrew literature, modern Hebrew literature? Yes, but my father wanted it very much. Did you ask your father why this interest in Hebrew literature? There was Hebrew literature after 1880, the Hebraic Zionists. He felt I should be able to read. He subscribed to Hebrew magazines. But in 1914, with the start of the First World War broke out, my father says, my father decided to leave Lemberg and leave everything there and go. We each got a little bundle of what was most needed and boarded the next train going west. This I remember vividly, a Russian bomb falling nearby. And in his memoirs, he writes a bit more about that. Beginning of World War I, the Russians advanced westward and stood before Lemberg. My parents were among those who decided to leave the city. Quickly, they packed silver and small valuables into straw mattresses in the bedroom. They and the 3 children, with some hand luggage, hurried to the railway station. The station was crowded with people waiting for a train going west toward Vienna. We landed in a cattle car packed with men, women, and children. The train moved slowly and made long stops, but move it did, and we were glad to be out of the danger zone. It was on this journey that my father decided not to go to Vienna because of the corrupt influence of the big city, which he knew well from his travels, but to stop instead in Ungarisch Brod in Moravia, known for its Jewish community and the Moses Jung's Jewish school. The information, however, was dated. Dr. Jung had some time ago moved to London to become rabbi of the Orthodox community. We remained in Brod anyway. It became clear that there wouldn't be a return to Lemberg to retrieve the valuables from the straw mattresses. Plans were made to move north, near the German border, so as to immigrate to Germany as soon as the war was over. In Brod, I came to know the way of life of a small, cohesive, secluded, pre-modern Jewish community, a valuable experience. I liked best the small, intimate Klaus, and especially the Sabbath afternoon service. The Jewish school, headed by Herr Fischl, was a joy, especially after the severe gymnasium in Lemberg. Diane Weiss gave me instruction in Talmud. Antisemitism. We stopped on our way in a little town. We returns now to Ungarisch Brod. And he said, although we were there for a short period, I experienced a lot of traditional Jewish life. From there, they went on to Bodenbach, which is in Silesia. And he writes about Bodenbach, where he lived with his family from 1915 to 1920. In it, I grew to full consciousness. The war was going on, food was scarce. I was given the notion that it is up to me to preserve the tradition and to teach it to others. I was the only boy in town outside the refugee group to engage in Hebrew studies. I assembled a small group of disciples and introduced them to the thinking and the very life of our ancients. Later on, this attitude to the Hebrew classics grew stronger and deeper and determined my life. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith, for your personal memories, for your dad's words, and for helping us honor the memories of your parents this evening. And I'm sure we are all struck in listening to his words and his story that nothing much changes under the sun. And we are still witnessing people migrating, refugees from that part of the world. It's very poignant to listen to you talking about 1914 and be here now as well. Now I'd like to introduce Dr. Rachel Fish, our Glatzer Memorial Weekend Scholar in Residence. Dr. Fish is the co-founder and scholar warrior at Boundless, a new think action tank partnering with community leaders to revitalize Israel education and take bold collective action to combat Jew hatred. Prior to co-founding Boundless, Dr. Fish was the executive director of the Foundation to Combat Antisemitism. She also served as the senior resident scholar at the Paul Isinger Foundation in New York City and executive director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies at Brandeis University. In her role at Brandeis, Dr. Fish trained the next generation of academics in the field of Israel studies. Dr. Fish has served on the faculty at Brandeis University, Harvard University, UMass Amherst. She has written articles for several publications in the mainstream press and in academic journals, and co-edited the book Essential Israel, Essays for the 21st Century. Dr. Fish is a frequent speaker in various Jewish community forums and beyond. Please help me welcome Dr. Rachel Fish, whose topic this evening is Defining Antisemitism.
Okay. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. It's so nice to be here in person and to be with you all. And thank you so much for the honor for the Glatzer Memorial Weekend. And thank you also to all the donors. And I'll just say that this comes full circle because when I graduated from my doctorate program at Brandeis, I was also given the honor of being the Glatzer speaker. So this really is full circle for me. So thank you. And it's really a pleasure to learn with you all weekend. I've participated in all of the adult ed programs, either in real time or listening to all of the recordings. And you've had incredible speakers throughout the course of the year. So I'm not sure I'm actually going to bring so much to the weekend, but I'm going to try my best to bring some insights as well as highlight aspects that may not have been directly touched upon. But you have had some incredible individuals, and I had time with Professor Eitan Hirsch just a few days ago even. So hopefully some of what you have learned, we will resurface as well as push it a little bit further. This evening, the topic is about defining anti-Semitism. So we think, right, that there should be a definition. But we're Jews, so there's never a definition, right? There have to be multiple definitions. So we're actually going to engage in a little bit of text study here to look at these definitions and understand where they intersect and where they diverge, and understand the context in which these definitions emerged, and understand how they are utilized today and for what purposes. That's the discussion this evening. How much time do we have? Exactly. I won't keep you all night, I promise. All right, so what's the definition of anti-Semitism? Well, the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League's definition of anti-Semitism is the following: the belief or behavior hostile toward Jews just because they are Jewish. It may take the form of religious teachings that proclaim the inferiority of the Jews, or political efforts to isolate, oppress, or otherwise injure them. It may also include prejudiced or stereotyped views about Jews. A definition. The working definition of anti-Semitism by the European Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia, which was also adopted by the United States State Department and the FBI, has a different definition. Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed toward Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. That then becomes the working definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. And as this definition has emerged, which it began as a working definition that was developed in 2003, it is first published in 2005, and then it is adopted by a variety of organizations, intergovernmental agencies, primarily focused on Holocaust-related issues by the period of 2015-2016. Today, it has become the primary accepted definition of anti-Semitism. The IHRA definition is one that is, as you can tell, a non-legally binding working definition, but it has included in it certain aspects related specifically to the state of Israel. You don't necessarily see that in the articulated definition that you have on the first page in bold, but what I would like you to do is to take a moment and read the paragraph with your, Chavruta, if you would like, sitting next to you or just by yourself, underneath that bold paragraph on the first page, and on the second page, briefly look at the bullets that are included as examples of the IHRA working definition. Because I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about how these bullets relate to the definition that you see in bold. So feel free to take a few moments and look at these documents. Okay. In this example of the definition, you see 11 illustrative examples, 7 of which focus on Israel. The rest don't necessarily talk directly about Israel and either focus on the Holocaust or traditional anti-Semitic tropes. What do you notice in some of these examples? What catches your eye? Yes. Okay, so the collective rather than focusing on individuals or individual acts per se. Yep. What else? Yeah, please. So which one do you think specifically does that? That's a good example. Yep. Right, so there is a piece here related to could you substitute in another minority group and not just Jews? We're going to talk about that in a second, though, because I would argue that by labeling this about a Jewish conspiracy or Jews having the ability to control while simultaneously being othered and dehumanized makes this very specific to Jews. But yes, I understand the point you are making. Yes, sir. So a theme of blame. The Jews are to blame. Yep. Good. Anything else that catches your attention? Yes. Right. And it's not law, right? It's this working definition that is utilized by international organizations, including the United Nations. It's utilized in order to get European countries and other countries on board to have this as a working definition on the books, whatever that may mean. It's even used, as we know, by municipalities, even local municipalities, and universities. Now, there's a pushback as well. It's not a pushback at the level of international organizations or countries, but the pushback is actually at the level of the university. Why do you think there is pushback by university presidents or administrators to accept this as a working definition? What would be the resistance? Academic freedom. That's right. So the issue is that there are some who would argue that this particular definition limits free speech and could potentially attempt to silence criticism of Israel. And that was the pushback in order to say we can't accept this as the working definition. And because there were, as most things are, unfortunately, in our society today, a political push by certain political individuals coming from particular political parties, all the more so this was seen as a potential pawn or weapon in the definition of anti-Semitism, and as a result, a new definition emerged. This new definition is what you will see on the second set of documents, which is from the Jerusalem Declaration of Anti-Semitism, which came about almost a little over a year ago, March 25th of 2021. The Jerusalem Declaration on Anti-Semitism was written by academicians associated with universities, but they signed it as individuals. Over 200 scholars were the ones who signed this document. The Van Leer Institute, are you familiar with the Van Leer Institute? So the Van Leer Institute is a think tank based in Jerusalem, right very close to the president's residence in Rehavia in Israel. And the Van Leer Institute, which tends to be politically left of center in Israel, was the organizing institution. But the individuals who wrote this document were not based in Israel, the majority of them. They were in mostly North American communities. If you look at this document, and you'll have to read the preamble on your own, but I would like you on the second page of the document to look at it and take a few moments to scan A, B, and C, but particularly focusing on B and C, because B and C is where the Israel piece of this enters the conversation. What do you notice in sections B and C in particular? What jumps out at you? Okay, so the idea of Israel as a Jewish national home isn't necessarily recognized as that by these academics in section C, and you see this very specifically, for example, in number 12, right, where criticizing or opposing Zionism as a form of nationalism or asking for a variety of potential constitutional arrangements, whether it's a state of all its citizens, which means no Jewish state, a confederation, a binational state, which today is the same as a state of all its citizens. It's not about what was imagined by Martin Buber in the 1920s, and other forms like that that don't recognize a Jewish state and a Palestinian state potentially lead to the dissolution of Israel as a Jewish national home for the Jewish people and a sovereignty. Yes. What else do you notice? Yes. Yes. So this gives more detail, for sure, and providing a larger context for how these authors are understanding the way in which anti-Semitism may manifest or may not be understood. Remember Natan Sharansky's 3D test? You've heard it from a few individuals during the presentations. And Natan Sharansky's 3D test is that if Israel is demonized, if Israel is dehumanized, and if Israel is held to a double standard, then Natan Sharansky would argue that that is a form of anti-Semitism. Section C does not agree with that framework, right? If you look at point number 15, it's very clear that even if Israel is held to a double standard, that doesn't mean inherently that it's an act of anti-Semitism or a form of anti-Semitism. So this is a counterposition to Sharansky's 3D test. That's one piece of this. The other piece that's very clear is point number 14 around the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, which of course, we could talk about it. What does it mean if you writ large understand, and how do you understand the BDS movement? What does it mean if you put the BDS movement in the context of what happened during the Durban conference in 2001? What does it mean if you look at the way in which certain Palestinian leaders like Marwan Barghouti and others articulate a position around BDS? And this would argue that BDS is not inherently anti-Semitic, but it can be, depending upon who's advocating or advancing it, whereas other definitions, like the IHRA definition, as well as the Sharansky definition, would ultimately hold boycott, divestment, and sanctions as a form, potentially a form of anti-Semitism. And I say potentially a form because we also know there has been a nuanced discussion that has existed within the Jewish community about what does it mean if you boycott or divest specifically from products coming, like from the West Bank, but not necessarily from all of Israel. And this has also been part of the discourse that we saw playing out, I don't even remember if it was this summer or early fall, even with an organization, a business like Ben & Jerry's. Remember with the ice cream. So this discussion around BDS here, and this definition, doesn't see it as anti-Semitic. Anything else that you want to comment on the Jerusalem Declaration? Yes. Right, which is the IHRA understanding, that's the Sharansky understanding, but it differs, for sure, in the Jerusalem Declaration. Right. So there is an element of that here. And this, I would argue, this particular definition is very inward focusing on an internal Jewish discourse without putting it into the context of what's happening in the world around us. I would argue that. Some of these authors would not agree with that position, but that's how I think this can be a problematic document, because the majority of the world is not having a nuanced discussion around what anti-Zionism has meant as a potential response within Jewish historical discussions around Zionism, diasporist positions, etc. An anti-Zionist position, which is for a talk later this weekend, it has been, in the larger world context, one that is about, does Israel have a right to exist as the starting point? And there's a clear answer to that. And the answer has been no. Which is why then we, some of us, see it as a double standard. Yes. This document does not have the same support internationally. It wasn't meant to have the same support among working government agencies around the United Nations and others, but it was meant to push the conversation in a different direction within institutions of higher education. Now, no university of higher education has accepted this as an acceptable position, but it poses as a counter to the IHRA, and it allows for universities to not feel as if they have to take the IHRA position, and they don't have to take this position, and they can just recognize that there are differing perspectives on this, and that they can honestly say, look, the Jews don't even agree. So that's a definition that exists, and it's very much, I would argue, part of a Jewish conversation and not part of a global conversation. But it's important for us as Jews to understand the internal Jewish conversation. There's one more definition that has emerged. The other definition that has emerged is called the Nexus document. Now, this is a document that came about also in 2021. It's coming from University of Southern California at the Annenberg School of Communication of Journalism. There was a task force created in order to workshop this potential definition. And this definition is also in a similar vein to counter the IHRA definition. This one was not created only by Jews. This one is created by Jews and non-Jews in order to be able to articulate not just for an internal discussion around higher education, but because it's coming from a school of communication and journalism, in order to highlight the need for journalists to also have the ability, in terms of freedom of speech, to engage critically with the discourse around Israel. So if you see this definition, like the Jerusalem documents, what's important to understand in these is that the more traditional aspects of anti-Semitic tropes, whether it's around understanding portrayals of Judaism and the othering of Judaism, whether it's around specific attributes of Jews, things related to the blood libel, dual loyalty, those remain very much intact in all of these definitions. The point of intersection in which they diverge focuses on Israel. So I'll give you just a moment to look at this definition just so you can see how it is framed. So if you look on the bottom of the back of the page of what is not anti-Semitic, it goes to some of the points that were made, similar to the Jerusalem document, such as points number 3 and 4. The idea that opposition to Zionism and/or Israel does not necessarily reflect specific anti-Jewish animus, nor purposefully lead to anti-Semitic behaviors and conditions. Someone might, for example, oppose the principle of nationalism or ethno-nationalist ideology. That's an example that they cite. So how does this play out? For example, if I'm working with college students, which I do all the time, and I hear a student say, well, it's not that I don't think Israel has a right to exist, I just think that Zionism is a form of white supremacy because it privileges Jews over any other community in the state. This would then be utilized by some to say that's criticism of Israel, whereas others would say this is a form of anti-Semitism. This is where it gets very complicated, particularly for young people to navigate. And not just young people, academics, teachers, administrators, and many of them want to be able to ensure academic freedom and freedom of speech, first and foremost, and therefore do not want to label something anti-Semitic because they don't want to be perceived as curtailing that academic freedom and freedom of speech. You also see number 4, paying disproportionate attention to Israel and treating Israel differently than any other country is not prima facie proof of anti-Semitism. This goes to that point of double standard. So they would argue because Israel receives a lot of funding from the American government, all the more so, it is the responsibility of individuals to highlight or hyper-focus on the Israel conversation. And yet we also know that there are plenty of other countries one could do that with, but that is not included in this conversation. This is a natural tension then between the way in which these documents understand the intersection of anti-Semitism and Israel. And it is much easier to define anti-Semitism when you don't include the Israel conversation, and it becomes tenfold more complicated for some, particularly in the field of education, but not exclusively, when Israel is part of that discussion. So I have a different definition. Because I figure if they can write a definition, why can't I write a definition? So my definition is the following. Jew hatred is the expressed desire to eliminate, either through physical elimination or the elimination of identity, of Judaism as a religion, Jews as a people, and or the collective movement for Jewish self-determination in the state of Israel. And the reason I use this definition is because we know that the way in which Jew hatred manifests in the 21st century is both through that desire of physical elimination, but also through this elimination of identity, meaning one's, whether real or imagined, engagement with Zionism and collective association with the Zionist movement. And this form of anti-Semitism has been coined as erasive anti-Semitism, a phrase you may have heard from Ben Freeman and Reut Institute. Have you heard of it? So erasive anti-Semitism is this form of anti-Semitism that suggests that you have to erase your identity as a Zionist, your particularism, your Jewishness as Zionism, and where those intersect, in order to be accepted by the universal, by those causes that you also care about. You must erase the Zionist identity or affiliation. So these two forms of anti-Semitism, the physical elimination that we know very well, coming mostly from the hard right, and the erasive, coming very firmly from the hard left, and sometimes those two collide. These two forms of anti-Semitism are the two forms that I think that we encounter, and that they have to be understood both as manifestations of anti-Semitism and with respect to Judaism, Jews, and the Jewish state. So that's where I would enter that definition, and I think it then becomes more all-encompassing because it takes into account both the individual and the collective, and it is no longer focused singularly on one. So Terry, I'm happy to leave it at that. I'm happy to take any questions or comments. I don't know how long you want folks to stick around this evening.
I've never seen anything like that in my life. I get back. You say anti-Semitism means Shem, by the way. Semite is Shem. And the Arabs are Semites. Get rid of that word. Don't use anti-Semite. And define different things that you go along. Because anti-Semite covers millions of things. And not even related to Jews. Say it's anti-Jews or anti-Semite.
Yeah. So I agree with you. So we know how the term came about, right? You're going to hear me talk about this tomorrow, so you don't want to hear it today. But you know how the term came about. Antisemitumus as a term is coined by Wilhelm Marr in 1879. Why does he say antisemitumus? Because the phrase that existed before antisemitumus was Judenhass, Jew hatred. Well, Jew hatred sounds very crass. It sounds very ugly, right? And this is a time in Germany in which they say this doesn't sound good, definitely doesn't make us elite intellectual Germans look so good. It's also at a point in time in which the pseudoscience of eugenics is beginning to emerge, right? So that the pure Aryan is elevated and those who aren't Aryan are denigrated. So Wilhelm Marr says, I have an idea. These Jews, let's call them, which they're already being called, the Oriental, the Easterner, the other, and the Semite. Why are they called the Semite? The Semite is a categorization specifically related to linguistics, Semitic languages, right? A root system, Shorashim, Arabic, Phoenician, Akkadian, Hebrew, coming from a particular geographical location, the Levant, the area of what we refer to as the Mediterranean. So this idea of Semite as a linguistic category is then applied to a people. Those people, i.e. the Jews, they are Semitic. That's how you get that in terms of the way in which it is presented in a European context. The Arab is not talked about as a Semite at this point in time in a European framework. So Wilhelm Marr says, enough of this Judenhass. It looks bad. We're going to say antisemitumus. It sounds much cleaner. Fast forward to 2019, 2020, 2021. I worked with a political scientist who does survey research, and we interviewed 10,500 13 to 35-year-olds across this country, demographically representative. We asked those individuals, what is anti-Semitism? This goes right to your point. The majority of them responded, IDK. I don't know. We also heard, well, what's a Semite? Totally fair question. And then we heard, I'm anti-racist, I'm anti-homophobic, I'm anti-Islamophobic, so I must be an anti-Semite. And we're thinking, no, you're an anti-Semite. But they don't even understand the terminology because it's this pseudo-scientific sanitized word as an English construct. It's very complicated. And so therefore, the term loses the power. So that's why, in my definition, I didn't say anti-Semitism. I said Jew hatred. Now, fascinatingly, when we asked people how they understood the term Jew hatred and hatred of Jews, they understood it very clearly. Very clear. But 50 and older did not like the term Jew hatred. They said, this is crass. This makes me uncomfortable. It's too in your face. which is why I like to use it. Yes, sir. Great. Let's do it. Yep. Ultimately, that's what they decided. Human rights. They did. Before even, human international. Correct. Yep. So the Ben and Jerry's would only be anti-Semitic by IHRA definition, not by the Jerusalem Declaration or the Nexus. By mine, they are. Yes. That's why I don't eat Ben and Jerry's anymore. Personal choice. So yes, by my definition, they're still anti-Semitic. Because for me, it's an expressed desire, again, to erase the collective movement for Jewish self-determination writ large, especially if you read the actual statement by the head of Ben and Jerry's, which also lumped West Bank as all of Israel. So for me, it was problematic. It wasn't a Peter Beinart discussion around boycotting products only in the West Bank. Not that I necessarily agree with that, but that is a Peter Beinart differentiation. So that's the Ben and Jerry's. The B'Tselem would be problematic for sure IHRA. It would not be problematic for the Jerusalem Declaration because they are explicit in point number 13, saying that even if contentious, it is not anti-Semitic in and of itself to compare Israel with other historical cases, including settler colonialism or apartheid. So that then means that's acceptable for the Jerusalem. It would also be acceptable for the Nexus document as well. Because number 2, even contentious, strident, or harsh criticism of Israel for its policies and actions, including those that led to the creation of Israel, is not per se illegitimate or anti-Semitic. For me, I would not label B'Tselem as anti-Semitic because I don't think it's actually a helpful position in engaging with the arguments. I do not agree that Israel is an apartheid state, so I would have that as a point of contention because I think it is not put in a historically accurate framework. But I wouldn't label it anti-Semitic because these are individuals who tend to be deeply committed to the Jewish state and are arguing about specifically Israel not living up to its aspirations. So I don't label it anti-Semitic, whereas the document coming from human rights, I label as anti-Semitic. And the reason I do is because those individuals are not committed to Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. They are not vested in any shape or form in those aspirations. They are not connected to it. And ultimately, those individuals said Israel has no right to exist, period. So that's why, for me, those two are different, even though I don't like that B'Tselem manipulates and weaponizes a term that is highly problematic in terms of the global conversation about Israel. Does that make sense? Yes. I don't know how many people know my definition, so I'd say we're batting 1,000. Here's what I think. I think my definition is actually pretty clear, and so it's helpful because I'm not playing word gymnastics. I also think it really matters to highlight the physical and the erasive, because not everyone is seeking to kill me, and yet they also don't want me to exist in a certain way. And so I think being able to highlight that is very valuable. And most individuals are not as familiar with erasive anti-Semitism, and they have more of an understanding of historical tropes and the way in which Jew hatred has emerged from the political hard right and the legacy of the white supremacy that we know, and from the Holocaust and et cetera. So I think that that is why it's necessary to bring this other element of anti-Semitism into the conversation, coming from the hard left, because I'm an individual who truly believes that the moment you only place anti-Semitism with one political group, you actually politicize anti-Semitism. And I think we've had organizations in our own Jewish communal ecosystem who have done that. And I think that we have to actually be able to clearly label it and define it and denounce it or address it or call it in, call it out, depending upon how we're supposed to engage with it. But we have to do it whether it's from the hard right, whether it's from the hard left, whether it's radical Islamism. Because then it becomes a political football and actually becomes a pawn for a political position. Yes? By accident. I'm Jewish, right? So, in all seriousness, some of you know, I grew up in the foothills of the Smoky Mountains in northeast Tennessee. So you know what there are not a lot of? Jews. So we learned at a very young age what it meant to be Jewish. Whether it was because when I would make rounds with my father at the hospital and people wanted to feel our heads to see if we had horns, whether it was because my younger brother and I would sit outside in the hall in the public school class because there was a prayer in the name of Jesus in public school, and we would watch my father every year go to the school board and explain why this isn't an infringement on the First Amendment and the Establishment Clause, and he was not a lawyer, he was a pediatrician. Whether it was because we had city officials who also used school time in order to create a very hostile environment to those who weren't Christian. We had the KKK before I was born, place a cross in front of our synagogue and burn it. My parents were there. So it's always been part of my life, whether or not it was something that I wanted to study or learn about. And when you grow up, and some of you may know this, in a place that's not Greater Boston, particularly the Northeast Corridor, you have to be able to articulate who you are at a pretty young age, even like over really mundane things. Why you don't eat pepperoni pizza at the sleepover and have bacon the next morning. Why you don't go to every Friday night football game. So my parents would tell you that, at the age of 5, I had already become an educator. And I will tell you, you heard in my bio, my academic, scholarship is not on anti-Semitism. I read everything that individuals write, but that's not my area of expertise. It's about Israeli history, Zionist thought, and Middle Eastern studies. But it became very clear to me very quickly that in the academy alone, the discourse around Israel was also extremely politicized. And I learned very quickly from firsthand experiences as a graduate student, ways in which Israel was presented, and the ultimate agenda was that starting place for many faculty about, does Israel have a right to exist? And so that has just constantly been a reality that I have had to address in various forms, which is why this is also some of the work that I do. And I want to say very clearly, when I'm doing Israeli history and Zionist history, it is not a focus on Jew hatred. unless it intersects with it. But you can teach about Israel without talking about anti-Semitism. And there's a reality that it's very rare these days in which you can talk about Jew hatred and not talk about Israel. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, the question is about, without splitting hairs, the difference or where there's intersection or divergence between academic freedom and freedom of speech. Right? We all have freedom of speech. That's what the blessing is of this Constitution. You do. You can say whatever you want. It may not be politically correct. You may get canceled. You may have a problem, professionally or personally. But I can stand out there on the corner of Trapello Road and say whatever I want. So when President Ahmadinejad was invited to Colombia, not once, not twice, but 3 times, that is not about freedom of speech, right? Meaning he can stand on the corner of the United Nations right outside and say whatever he wants. But the university decided to invite him in and give him that platform. And they say this is about freedom of speech. Well, let him stand on what's the address of Columbia. Y'all, I know Rabbi Lerner knows it. Right, exactly. Let him stand there. He can scream with a megaphone. I'll give him his megaphone. But there's no reason President Bollinger has to invite him in and give him a platform. That's how I feel about it. But often they're conflated by many academics, but not all. And there is a challenge around the way in which academics are concerned in general about how or who is telling them what to teach, when to teach, what subject matter, etc. And around the Israel conversation, that is a lightning rod. It very much is. So you have advocacy organizations, both from the hard right and from the hard left, who police it and don't understand that if you are doing your job as an academic, you should be exposing students to the multiplicity of perspectives in order for them to have a complex understanding. You are not there to create advocates of any kind when you're in the university. But not every academic feels that way. Sure. I haven't looked over here. Any questions, comments? Yes, sir. Yes. Totally. But you have to come to tomorrow's talk. Because otherwise I'm going to say now and then you're not going to come. Okay. But that is tomorrow. Tomorrow we're going to talk about exactly that. That's right. Sharon has one question. We have to defer. We have to defer. Yep. think you're right. That's exactly right, Sharon. I fully agree, which is like with B'Tselem, why I wouldn't just label it anti-Semitic. I find it would be very problematic. So it's two things that I find in that conversation. One is about the aspiration, the Or Lagoyim. When I think about Martin Buber's Hebrew humanism, when I think about cultural spiritual Zionists, who do they cite? The prophets, right? That's their role model. That's who they want us to emulate. And I read the Declaration of Independence. And when I read the Declaration of Independence, it's very clear that it's, as it should be, an aspirational document. And then you look at what the reality is. And they inherently have a tension, as they should, right? Just like this country. But it's the conversation about Israel having those aspirations and not meeting those aspirations, and yet trying to be able to exist as both a Jewish and democratic state. So I say that's very real. And we, students of Israel, committed individuals to the Jewish community, those who care about Klal Yisrael, have to engage with that deeply. And all the more so when Israel has and does hold power over the West Bank. There's no getting around that has to be dealt with, addressed, and be part of a meta conversation and allow space for discourse around it. That's very different than when Paul O'Brien, right, says what he says, because he's not a committed part of that conversation. What Michael Walzer talks about being a connected critic. And when he talks, he's a professor emeritus from Princeton, and when he talks about that, he also talks about the prophets as connected critics. Paul O'Brien is not a connected critic. Ben and Jerry's is not a connected critic, right? And so they like to say, you think that you should be a light unto the nations, and look what you do. So it's thrown in the face of Israel. So that's where we have to make space for the internal conversation, and we have to recognize when it's being weaponized in order to be able to suggest that Israel shouldn't exist. And then motive matters. Who are the actors involved in that conversation? Because I fully agree with you, particularly the younger you go, the more we need that space. And I don't want it to be used as a justification to say you can always hold Israel to a double standard. So for example, very recently, I was talking to some young college students, and you hear this all the time, college and I don't believe any nationalism should exist. Okay. Right? Okay. But we also know that's not the world order. We also know they're young. So then you have to try to figure out, what is this really about? Is it about you're not happy with Israel's not reaching those aspirations when they're deeply, committed to that conversation? Or is it something else? And I hear Ben Gurion in my head talking about, we know Israel will be normal, right? That's the language he uses when we have prostitutes and thieves and murderers. Okay. So these are real tensions for sure, and part of how I think about it, and it does go to the anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism conversation as well, is what's the internal Jewish conversation, which has to be and is different in some ways from the external conversation, in which it's not about the nuance and the complexity and the discourse, but rather a very clear end goal in which this world does not have a Jewish state. So that's where I see that, but I'm fully where you are as well internally. Yes? I guess I always just wondered to what end, for what purpose. I don't know, and I'm not saying this to be controversial. I'm not sure I understand why it matters if a synagogue says we agree with the IHRA definition. I'm not sure I understand why it matters. I totally understand why you want Czechoslovakia to say it. Right? Like, to me, there's a big difference. There's a really big difference. And I also want Jews to understand what this definition is and why it matters, and really understand, to the point of how does this play out in the real world. So here, we'll give you an example. May 2021, when you have a caravan of cars careening down Wilshire Boulevard, screaming, "Where are the Jews?" Or you can be in a suburb of London with profanity saying, "Find the Jewish women, rape and murder them." It's very clear to me what's happening. None of that has to do with a nuanced discussion of Zionism. It's not about where the green line should be. Do you have settlements? Do you not? It's pure, ugly Jew hatred. I don't need Ira to tell me that. So for me, it totally depends on the context and the rationale, but to what end matters.